I drove into the ferry lot just before sunrise, thinking I'd surprise my son and grab breakfast together. The ocean fog was so thick you could taste it. Then I saw an old van parked off to the side, windows filmed over from someone breathing inside. I stepped closer. 2 little heads were curled up under one jacket, and my son wouldn't look me in the eye. Lucas was the first one to wake up. He blinked at me like I was a stranger, then his face softened when he recognized my voice. Noah didn't even open his eyes. He just scooted closer to his brother, still half asleep, like they'd done this 100 times. I didn't ask Ethan anything right there, not in the van, not in front of them. I just opened my back door and said, "Hey guys, let's get something warm in your stomach." There was a diner a few minutes up the road, the kind with a faded sign, vinyl booths, and coffee that tastes like it's been working overtime. The waitress looked at the kids, looked at Ethan, looked at me.
She didn't say a word. She just grabbed 3 menus and slid a basket of crackers onto the table like it was the most normal thing in the world. Lucas kept staring at the window. Noah picked at the edge of a napkin, quiet. Ethan sat with his shoulders slightly forward, hands under the table, like he was trying to make himself smaller. I ordered pancakes for the boys and eggs for Ethan. He tried to protest. He barely got the words out. I cut him off with a nod, not an argument, just a decision. When the plates came, Lucas finally started eating. Slow at first, then faster, like his body remembered what safe felt like. That's when I leaned in and said, "You two are going to sit right here and finish up, all right?" Lucas looked at me. "Are we in trouble?" "No," I said. "You're just hungry." I slid out of the booth and motioned with my head toward the little hallway by the bathrooms, where the noise of the diner faded into a low hum. Ethan followed me like he didn't know what else to do. We stood there under a flickering light, next to a machine that sold cheap candy and travel-sized toothpaste. He wouldn't meet my eyes. A good father doesn't want to be seen at the bottom. Not by strangers, not by his kids, and definitely not by his own dad. He swallowed hard. "I wasn't supposed to. I didn't plan for this." "I know," I said. That was all. I didn't say, "What the hell happened?" I didn't say, "How could you let it get this far?" Those are the kinds of questions that make a man shut down. And Ethan was already shut down. He took a breath that sounded like it hurt. "I lost the house," he said, like he was admitting a crime. "Okay. I don't have the keys anymore. I don't have anything in my name that matters." He tried to laugh, but it came out thin. "I'm not even allowed to see my boys like a normal dad," he added. That's when he finally looked at me, just for a second. And I saw it. Something worse. That look people get when they're trying to decide if they should keep fighting or just disappear. "They've got it on paper," he said, "that I'm a risk." "A risk?" I repeated. He nodded. "For the kids, financially, emotionally, whatever word they needed that week." He leaned his head back against the wall. "They made it sound clean, professional, like they were doing it for the boys." He paused. "Claire told everyone I was unstable, not in a crazy way, in a quiet way, like I was slipping, like I couldn't be trusted." He rubbed his face with both hands, slow, like he was wiping off a mask. "I went to court thinking the truth would be obvious," he said. "I thought if I just showed up and spoke like a grown man, they'd see it." He let out a breath. "That's not how it worked." I watched his hands. They were rough, grease under the nails. The hands of a guy who fixes things, builds things, not the hands of someone who hurts kids. "What about work?" I asked. What about work? I asked. I still work, he said quickly. I do. I've been picking up contracts, whatever I can. But the minute the filing started, clients got nervous. They don't say it, they just stop calling. He stared at the floor. And when you lose steady work, you lose leverage. You lose options. He said it like he'd learned it the hard way. I waited a beat. Where are your documents? I asked. He blinked. What? Any paperwork, I said. Anything you still have. Emails, statements, notices, court papers, anything with dates. Ethan's throat moved like he was swallowing something bitter. I have a folder, he said, in a storage unit. Mostly copies. Stuff I didn't even understand when I signed it. Good, I said. He gave me a look like he didn't believe that could matter. Ethan, I said, keeping my voice steady, we're not going to win this by proving you're a good man. He flinched. I held up a hand. You are a good man. Your boys know it. I know it. He stared at me, finally listening. They're using paper, I said. So we're going to use paper. His jaw tightened. You don't understand who you're up against. I understand enough, I said. I just met them in that parking lot. In the way you wouldn't look at me. He looked away again. Finish your coffee, I said. Then we're going to that storage unit. He hesitated. Dad, we're not debating, I said, calm. We're moving. I glanced back toward the booth. Lucas was watching us over the rim of his cup, trying to read the room. I gave him a small nod, the kind that says, You're okay, you can keep eating. When I turned back to Ethan, his eyes were wet, but he didn't let anything fall. Do you know what they wrote about you? I asked. He nodded once. Enough to make a judge nervous. And do you know what beats nervous? I said. He didn't answer. Clarity, I said. Dates, records, consistency. I started walking back toward the table. Ethan followed. And as we slid into the booth, Noah finally looked up and smiled like he'd forgotten he was allowed to. That's when I made a promise to myself. Not out loud, just quietly, the way you promise something that you intend to keep. Whatever story they'd told about my son, we were going to replace it with one thing that doesn't bend. The truth. Back at the booth, the boys were finishing the last of their pancakes. Lucas had syrup on his sleeve. Noah was building a little fort out of sugar packets, lining them up like it mattered. Ethan kept his eyes on them, like he was afraid someone would walk in and take them away. When the check came, I paid it without looking down. Then I slid my car keys across the table. Grab your jacket, I told Ethan. We're going to your storage unit. He froze. Dad, it's not gonna help. It will, I said. Not because it fixes everything. Because it gives us a starting point. We walked out into the fog again. Lucas held my hand. Noah held Ethan's. That small detail told me more than any court filing ever could. In the parking lot, Ethan stopped by the van and stared at it for a second, like he was looking at a grave. Then he opened the driver's door and pulled out a beat-up backpack. He unzipped it and showed me what was inside. A folded visitation schedule, a few printed emails, 2 copies of the same court order creased at the corners like he'd read it 100 times, and a photo of the boys at a beach a year ago. He touched the photo with his thumb and then tucked it back like it burned. I'm only allowed to see them at the community center, he said, twice a week, supervised. He said that last word quietly, like saying it too loud would make it more real. I nodded once. Okay. Then I asked the question I knew everyone watching would ask. How did you end up with them last night?
Ethan let out a breath and leaned his shoulder against the van.
"Because real life doesn't move like paperwork," he said.
He looked at me. "And because sometimes the rules don't fit what's happening in front of you." Here's the part people don't understand until they've lived it. Family court isn't a straight line. It's a room full of doors, and half of them are cracked open. Ethan's order said supervised visits at the center. It didn't say he was never allowed to be near his kids outside of it under any circumstance. It didn't say he was a criminal. It didn't say he couldn't pick them up if Claire agreed. And that's where the gray starts. Because a lot of these cases don't run on what's right. They run on what's on paper, and what people can later claim happened. Ethan didn't take the boys because he wanted to break rules. He took them because Claire called him the night before and said she needed help. Her words, not mine. She told him her father had a dinner, a work thing, something important. She said, "Can you just take them for a few hours? The center is closed, it's last minute." And Ethan did what most dads would do. He showed up. Because when you're starving for your own kids, you don't argue over technicalities. You just go. He picked them up in the parking lot behind a grocery store. Claire didn't get out of her car. She rolled the window down 2 inches and handed over their backpacks like she was doing him a favor. Then she said the line that made my skin crawl when Ethan repeated it. "Bring them back on time. And don't make this weird." Ethan swallowed. I thought maybe she was easing up. He looked away. I thought maybe the fight was cooling down. It wasn't. Claire didn't answer when he texted her later. Her father didn't answer when he called. And when the boys fell asleep in the van, Ethan did the only thing he could afford to do. He stayed put. Because driving around all night with kids in the back isn't safer. It's just moving the same problem to a different street. Now here's the second part people miss. In these situations, there's the order and there's the routine. The order is what the judge signed. The routine is what happens when people are tired, stressed, bargaining, making side deals in text messages. "I'll let you see them if you stop pushing. I'll drop the complaint if you sign this. Just take them tonight, but you owe me." It's messy, it's emotional, and it creates a trap. Because the moment something goes wrong, the side that has money and lawyers says, "He violated the order." Even if they were the one who asked for it, even if the kids were fine, even if the dad did it to keep them safe. That's what I meant when I said we weren't going to win by proving Ethan was a good man. Good men lose these cases every day. They lose because they don't understand the game. They believe the system will recognize decency, but the system recognizes documents, dates, receipts, consistency. We pulled up to the storage unit a few miles inland, past the fog line, where the sun was finally starting to show. Ethan punched in the code like he'd done it so many times it didn't even feel like his life anymore. Inside, the unit smelled like cardboard and dust and old decisions. There was a plastic bin labeled court, another labeled business, another labeled kids. That last one hit me harder than the first two. Ethan opened the court bin and handed me a stack. Every page had the same theme. Not that he was dangerous, not that he hurt anyone, just that he was unstable, financially risky, lacking consistent housing. Words that sound clean in a courtroom and destroy you in real life. I flipped through the papers and kept my face still. Then I looked at him. "From this point on," I said, "we don't live in the gray." Ethan frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean," I said, "no more favors. No more verbal agreements. No more, 'she said it was fine.'" I held up the visitation schedule. "This is what exists. This is what we follow." I pointed to the emails. "And this is what we collect." He stared at me like he didn't believe he was allowed to do that,
like he thought gathering proof was something only rich people did. I lowered my voice. "When you're the weaker side," I said, "the law doesn't automatically protect you." Ethan's eyes tightened. "You have to make it impossible for them to lie." I didn't say it with anger. I said it like a fact, because that's what it is. We loaded the bins into my trunk. Ethan carried the kids' bin like it weighed more than plastic should. Lucas and Noah climbed into the back seat and started talking about the ferry boats again, like kids do when they sense the adults have stopped panicking. As I pulled out of the storage lot, Ethan stared straight ahead. "Dad," he said, quiet, "what if they say I took them without permission?" I didn't answer right away. I waited until we hit the main road. Then I said, "Then we stop giving them stories." He swallowed. "We give them facts." The bins stayed in my trunk that afternoon, not because I didn't want to look at them, because I wanted to look at them the right way. We drove back toward the coast, the fog thinning out as the sun climbed. Lucas and Noah fell asleep again, heads tilted toward each other, their breaths in sync, like they'd been practicing it since birth. Ethan kept both hands on the wheel, 10 and 2, like he was taking a driving test, like one wrong move would get him disqualified from being a father. I watched him in the passenger seat. He wasn't weak. He wasn't careless. He was controlled, but not in the way people think. He was controlled the way a man gets controlled when he realizes the world is just waiting for him to slip. He spoke without looking at me. "I should have fought harder," he said. He said it flat, like a sentence he'd repeated so many times, it didn't even hurt anymore. "You didn't lose because you didn't fight," I told him. "You lost because you were fighting with your hands tied." He let out a breath and kept his eyes on the road. "They say I'm a risk," he said again. "Financial risk, emotional risk, like I'm some kind of liability." He swallowed. "And the worst part is, I can't even react. That's the part most people don't understand. In these cases, the guy who stays calm gets called cold. The guy who gets angry gets called dangerous. And the guy who tries to explain gets called manipulative. It's a trap built out of labels. Ethan had learned that the hard way. He told me about the last time he tried to push back. Not yell, not threaten, just push back. It was at the community center after one of those supervised visits. A staff member had asked him to sign a sheet confirming the visit went smoothly. He'd hesitated. He'd said, "I need to add a note." Claire's mom interrupted twice and told the boys what to call me. He said it calmly. He said it like a reasonable adult. And the staff member's face changed. Not angry, nervous. The kind of nervous that makes people start protecting themselves. She'd lowered her voice and said, "Ethan, I don't want any conflict." Conflict. That word. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't done anything. But the moment he challenged the script, he became the problem. And then it showed up in the notes. Father appeared frustrated. Father questioned staff decisions. Father seemed agitated. Agitated. Not assertive, not concerned. Agitated. One word, 3 seconds. And now you've got a paper trail. Ethan learned something after that. He learned to keep his mouth shut. He learned to smile at the wrong moments. He learned to nod even when his stomach turned. Not because he agreed, because he was afraid. Not afraid of Claire, afraid of losing the only window he still had. If you've never been in that position, it looks pathetic from the outside. But from the inside, it's survival. When your kids are the leverage, you start measuring every emotion like it costs you money. I said, "Ethan, you've been playing defense." He glanced at me. "Because every time I move, it gets used against me. Exactly, I said. So we stop giving them your emotions. We give them your consistency. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. His silence was the answer. Here's a hard truth. A lot of people think the system will notice your character, that if you're a decent man, it will show. But these cases don't run on vibes. They run on patterns. And when you're the one being accused, your job is to become boring, predictable, unshakable. So there's nothing to twist. We pulled into a small grocery store lot near the cabin I'd rented for a week. Off-season, cheap, quiet. Not a solution, a base camp. Lucas woke up when the car stopped. He rubbed his eyes and said, "Are we home?" Ethan's throat tightened. He didn't trust his voice. I said, "We're safe." That's when I saw it, that flicker in Ethan's face. He wanted to say 100 things. He wanted to explain. He wanted to apologize. He wanted to promise. But he didn't. He just nodded and got out of the car and opened the back door for the boys. A good man can carry a lot without complaining, but even good men break if you keep telling them they're dangerous. And the system doesn't break you with punches. It breaks you with paperwork, with notes, with labels, with people saying the same thing until you start wondering if you're the only one who can't see it. We got inside the cabin. The boys ran straight to the living room like they'd never seen carpet before. Ethan stood in the doorway and looked around like he didn't deserve walls. I set my keys on the counter. Then I pulled the quart bin out of the trunk and put it on the kitchen table, right in the center, not hidden, not shoved in a corner. I popped the lid. Ethan didn't sit. He hovered. I flipped through the papers again. Then I looked up at him and said, "You're going to hear this from me once, and then we're done talking about it." He stared at me. "Your silence wasn't weakness," I said. "It was fear." His jaw tightened. "Because you knew one bad moment could cost you your kids." He looked down, and that told me I'd hit the truth. I leaned forward, not loud, not dramatic, just clear. "From now on," I said, "you stay quiet in the places that want your reaction." Ethan's eyes lifted. "And you speak in the places that count." He breathed out through his nose. "Like where?" I tapped the bin. "Here," I said. "In records, in timelines, in receipts, in messages, in what we can prove." I paused. Then I gave him the line he needed to carry. "Stay silent in the moment," I said. "But from now on, we talk in documents." Ethan swallowed. Not because he didn't understand, because for the first time in months, he could see a path that didn't require him to become someone he wasn't. He didn't have to scream. He didn't have to beg. He didn't have to prove his heart to people who were paid not to care. He just had to do one thing: be steady, and collect the truth until it got heavy enough that no one could lift it and pretend it wasn't there. That night, after Lucas and Noah were finally asleep, the cabin went quiet in a way that felt unnatural. The waves outside kept moving, the old refrigerator kept humming. But inside, everything else felt like it was holding its breath. Ethan sat at the small kitchen table with the quart bin open in front of him. He didn't touch the papers. He just stared at them like they could bite. I made coffee, not because we needed it, because it gave my hands something to do. When I set a mug down in front of him, he flinched like he'd forgotten I was there. "Show me where it started," I said. He swallowed. Then he pulled out a thin folder from the business bin. It was labeled in his handwriting, "Tax." He opened it slowly, like he was ashamed of the word. "It wasn't a punch," he said.
It wasn't screaming. He looked up at me for a second. It was paperwork. That's how modern betrayal works. Not with violence, with signatures. Ethan slid a few documents across the table. They looked boring. Clean letterhead, boxes to initial, a line to sign, and language that felt like it was written to put you to sleep. Claire had brought them to him on a Friday night. He remembered the details too clearly. Pizza boxes on the counter, the boys watching cartoons, Claire acting calm, almost sweet. She'd said, "We need to tighten things up for tax season." She'd said, "My dad's accountant can help." She'd said, "If we restructure the ownership, it'll protect you." Protect you. That's the word that makes good men relax. Because a good man thinks protection is what family does.
Ethan initialed where she pointed. He signed where she circled. He trusted her, because that's what husbands do when the house is still warm and the kids are still laughing in the other room. He didn't realize he was signing away control. Not in one dramatic moment, in layers. First, it was a temporary change in how the company's equity was held. Then a bridge account for cash flow. Then a family trust vehicle, because it sounded responsible. It always sounded responsible. There's a trick in that. If you label something as responsible, people stop asking questions. Ethan rubbed his forehead with his thumb. "I didn't even know what half the words meant," he said. And every time I hesitated, she'd smile and say, "Babe, it's standard." Standard. Another word that makes you stop fighting. He pulled out an email printout. A message chain between Claire and a firm I recognized by name, one of those coastal outfits that handles wealthy families like it's a routine oil change. Ethan wasn't on the chain. That was the first red flag with weight. He pointed at a line. "Look," he said. "They're talking about me like I'm not even real." He didn't sound angry. He sounded small. And that told me everything. He'd been living in a world where decisions were being made about him without him. Claire didn't need to hit him. She didn't need to threaten him. She just needed to move the pieces while he was trying to keep the kids happy and the business running. Then, when she was ready, she changed the story. Overnight, Ethan went from hard-working startup dad to financial risk, from steady engineer to unreliable provider, from quiet guy under pressure to unstable. And because those labels fit a certain stereotype, because they sound like they could be true, people accepted them. A neighbor, a school administrator, a friend who didn't want to get involved, a judge with 10 cases that day. All they needed was a clean narrative. Ethan showed me the first notice he got. Not a letter from the bank, not a warning. A formal email from the company portal. Access updated. That was the phrase. Access updated. He tried to log into the company dashboard the next morning. Password didn't work. He requested a reset. No response. He called the accounting line. They told him he wasn't an authorized user anymore. He thought it was a mistake. He thought it was a technical glitch. He drove to the office. His keycard still opened the door, but his name wasn't on the internal payroll system. Not because he'd been fired, because someone had moved him. On paper. That's when he finally confronted Claire. And that's when she did what manipulators always do when you ask the right question. She didn't answer it. She attacked your character. She said, "Why are you acting like this?" She said, "You're paranoid." She said, "You're spiraling again." Again. Like it had happened before. Like it was a pattern. Like he was the kind of man who couldn't be trusted with money or emotions. Ethan lowered his voice. "The first time she said it, I laughed," he admitted. "The second time, I got angry." He paused. "The third time, I stopped talking." Because he knew anger would become evidence. In a world like this, your reaction is their resource. They don't just steal your money, they try to steal your credibility. They make you look like the type of person who would lose control. So when the control is taken from you, everyone shrugs and says, "Yeah, that tracks." I picked up the documents and started stacking them into piles. Not dramatic, just methodical. "Do you have the emails on your phone?" I asked. Ethan blinked. "Some of them. Claire deleted a lot from the shared account." "Okay," I said. "Then we recover what we can." I pulled my phone out and opened my notes. Dates, names, logins, who had access, when it changed. "Did you ever get a notification when the ownership was moved?" I asked. Ethan hesitated. Then he nodded slowly and reached into the folder again. He pulled out one single-page statement, a confirmation. No emotion in it, no apology, just a line that made my stomach tighten. Membership interest assigned to trust entity. Assigned. Like he was furniture. Like he was a number. Ethan watched my face and said, "I didn't even know it was possible to lose your life like that." I didn't look up. I kept stacking. "Most people don't," I said. "That's why it works." Then I said the thing I wanted him to hear without turning it into a speech. "They didn't beat you with strength," I told him. "They beat you with structure." I slid the piles into 4 categories: corporate documents, trust paperwork, email records, court filings. Then I pointed at the empty space on the table. "And this," I said, "is where we put the truth." Ethan's eyes flicked to the door where the boys were sleeping. He whispered, "What if it's too late?" I finally looked at him. "It's not too late," I said, "but it does mean one thing." He waited. "No more talking like a hurt husband," I said. "We talk like people building a case." I closed the bin lid, not because we were done, because we were starting. And somewhere in the other room, Lucas turned in his sleep and murmured something I couldn't make out. Ethan stared at the wall like he was listening for proof that his life was still his. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't offer comfort that sounded pretty. I just set it clean. "Tomorrow," I told him, "we pull every record we can. And we stop letting her paperwork be the only story anyone sees." The next morning I drove into town before the fog burned off. Ethan stayed back at the cabin with the boys. He didn't argue. He just nodded like a man who'd learned that arguing only creates more noise for someone else to weaponize. I told him I'd be gone an hour. I was gone 3. Because the first betrayal wasn't the paperwork. The first betrayal was realizing how many people were willing to play along. I parked outside a coffee shop near the industrial strip where Ethan's old startup used to rent space. It wasn't the kind of place you meet friends. It was the kind of place you meet people who don't want to be seen. Ethan had given me one name the night before, Caleb Shaw. They'd built the early version of the product together. Late nights, cheap energy drinks, jokes that only make sense when you're exhausted and broke. Ethan said Caleb was the first person he called when things started going sideways. Caleb had said, "I'm staying neutral." That's what Ethan told me. But neutral is a word that changes meaning when money enters the room. Caleb walked in 5 minutes late. He looked around before he sat down. He didn't take his jacket off. He didn't order anything. He kept his phone face down like it was a landmine. "Robert," he said, like my name tasted unfamiliar. I didn't waste time. I slid a printed copy of the court schedule across the table. Then I slid a second paper. A declaration, signed, stamped. Caleb's name at the bottom. He didn't reach for it. He just stared at it and swallowed. "Ethan didn't know this existed," I said. Caleb's eyes flicked up. He's got enough going on. That's one way to say it, I said. The declaration was written in polite language. No insults, no shouting, just clean sentences that cut like glass. Ethan demonstrated poor financial judgment. Ethan struggled to maintain stable professional relationships. Ethan's behavior raised concerns about long-term reliability. The kind of phrases people use when they want to ruin you without sounding cruel. And the thing that hit hardest wasn't the words, it was the tone. It read like someone had been paid to sound reasonable. Caleb finally picked the paper up. His fingers trembled just slightly.
I didn't write it like that, he muttered.
But you signed it, I said. He opened his mouth, then he closed it again. That was the moment I understood. He wasn't angry at Ethan. He wasn't even loyal to Claire. He was afraid. Not the kind of fear you show with tears. The kind you show by choosing the safer side and calling it neutral. Caleb set the paper down and stared at the table. You don't get it, he said quietly. They came at me with attorneys. Who's they? I asked. He hesitated. Then he said it. Martin Donovan. The name landed heavy even in a coffee shop full of strangers. Caleb cleared his throat like he wanted to unsay it. Martin's people called me. They said it was just due diligence. They wanted context. They wanted to understand the situation. I didn't move. I didn't react. I let the silence do the work. Caleb kept going because people talk when you don't rescue them. They said if I told the truth, it could drag me into it, he said. Depositions. Subpoenas, audits. They said I'd be spending money I don't have just to prove I wasn't part of Ethan's mess. Was it his mess? I asked. Caleb's jaw tightened. No, he said. Not loudly, not bravely, just honest. For a second. Then he looked away again. They offered me a contract, he added. There it was, the second betrayal. Not the wife, not the court, the friend who stayed quiet until he got a price. I kept my voice even. What kind of contract? Caleb reached into his bag and pulled out a folder like he'd been carrying it around just to convince himself it was real. A consulting agreement, clean branding, a company name that sounded generic, Pacific Harbor Advisory. And at the bottom, a signature line, already signed by Caleb. He flipped to the payment schedule, one number, then another, then another. It wasn't a fortune, it was worse than that. It was just enough to make a man tell himself he wasn't selling out. $10,000 up front, $5,000 a month, a strategic advisory role, no real duties, just a retainer. A leash made of polite paper. I didn't say you were bought. I didn't need to. Caleb's eyes were already wet, but he wouldn't blink. I've got a kid, he said. I've got rent. I've got... I know, I said, and I meant it. Because this is the part nobody likes to admit out loud. Most betrayals don't happen because someone hates you. They happen because you're suddenly the expensive option. Caleb leaned forward, voice tight. Ethan could have fought back, he said. He could have been louder. He could have... He couldn't, I cut in, still calm. Because the second he got loud, you would have called him unstable too. Caleb froze. I let that sit. Then I said, you gave them the kind of statement courts love. Not dramatic, not emotional. Concerned, reliability, financial judgment. You didn't punch him. You dressed him in a label. Caleb looked down at his hands like he didn't recognize them. I didn't think it would go this far, he whispered. It always goes this far, I said. That's the point. I took out my phone and snapped a photo of the consulting agreement. Front page, payment schedule, company name, signature. Caleb flinched. You can't use that, he said. I'm not using anything, I replied. I'm collecting facts. He stared at me, breathing shallow. What do you want? He asked. I didn't lean in. I didn't threaten. I just gave him a clean choice. I want you to tell the truth, I said. Not to me, on record, in the right room, with the right people listening. Caleb's face tightened. They'll ruin me, he said. I nodded once. They might try, I said. But here's what you need to understand. I tapped the contract folder lightly. They didn't hire you because you're important. They hired you because you're useful. And the second you stop being useful, I continued, they won't protect you. They'll replace you. Caleb swallowed hard. I stood up and slid the declaration back toward him. Read what she signed, I said. Then decide who you want to be when your kid is old enough to ask what happened. I left the coffee shop without raising my voice. Outside, the sun had finally started cutting through the fog. I sat in my truck for a moment and stared at the photo on my phone. That was the day Ethan lost more than money. He lost a witness, a friend, a piece of social proof the system respects. And now I understood the real shape of this fight. It wasn't just Claire. It wasn't even just Martin. It was the way people stay neutral until neutrality gets a paycheck. I started the engine, and I drove back to the cabin with one more file in my pocket. Not to punish anyone. To put the truth where it couldn't be ignored. That afternoon, I didn't drive back to the ferry lot. I drove inland. There's a stretch of the coast where everything looks expensive, even the air. And then, 10 minutes later, you're passing old cedar cabins with peeling paint and a for rent sign that's been sun-bleached for years. That's where I found it. A small place tucked behind a line of wind-bent pines. Off-season. No tourists, no noise. Just a porch that leaned a little and a roof that didn't. The landlord didn't ask many questions. He didn't want a story. He wanted a deposit. I paid it. Then I walked through every room like an inspector, not a guest. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen that had seen better decades, a living room with a coffee table that wobbled if you touched it wrong. It wasn't a dream home, but it was a door that locked. And in Ethan's situation, a door that locks is a luxury. That night, I went back to the cabin and told Ethan to pack. He stared at me like I'd insulted him. I can't afford. I didn't ask what you can afford, I said. I asked if you can carry boxes. He exhaled through his nose, a tired kind of laugh. Lucas and Noah were on the floor, building something out of mismatched blocks. They didn't look up. Kids get used to instability faster than adults do. That's what scared me. The next morning we moved before the fog lifted. I loaded what we could into the van, then we drove to the little cabin and brought everything inside like we were smuggling our own life back. A mattress, 2 duffel bags, a grocery bag with cereal and fruit, a shoebox full of papers Ethan kept wrapped in a sweatshirt like it was fragile. I didn't decorate. I didn't try to make it feel cozy with words. I made it safe with actions. I fixed what mattered first. I tightened the front door latch. I replaced the broken smoke detector. I ran hot water until it stayed hot. I bought 2 cheap space heaters and set them where little hands wouldn't reach. Then I went to the store and bought things that don't look emotional on camera, but change everything. Soap, Band-Aids, toothbrushes, a small first aid kit, a nightlight for the hallway, and 2 sets of bedding that matched. Not because it's cute, because when children sleep under matching blankets, their nervous system gets the message. We're not running tonight. Ethan watched me do all of it without speaking. He wanted to say thank you. But men like him don't say thank you when they feel ashamed. They say it by standing up and doing the next job. So I gave him the next job. Tomorrow, I said, we get you working. He blinked. You're not applying for your dream job, I cut in. You're applying for proof. He didn't like that. No man likes hearing his life reduced to evidence. But that was the reality. In court, I'm trying sounds like a story. A paycheck sounds like a fact. The next day, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop while Ethan made calls. Not to friends, not to people who felt bad. To hiring managers, to recruiters, to the kind of places that don't care about your personal drama as long as you show up and do the work. By the end of the week, he had a job. Not glamorous, not his dream, but it was steady. It had an offer letter. It had start dates. It had pay stubs coming. And that's what the system respects. Then we handled the boys. Not emotionally, logistically. I called the local school district and asked what they needed to enroll 2 6-year-olds. They didn't care about the whole war story. They cared about forms, birth certificates, proof of address, immunization records, emergency contacts. So we built a folder, a real one, tabs, copies, backups. Ethan dug through his box of papers like it was a minefield, and every time he hesitated, I reminded him. We're not proving you're a good person, I said. We're proving you're stable. We got them a doctor's appointment, a checkup, a printed summary, 2 names on official letterhead. Lucas and Noah sat on the paper-covered exam table, swinging their legs, talking about nothing. That's how kids survive. They talk about nothing because the adults can't handle the truth. That evening, when we drove back to the cabin, Ethan didn't look like a man who'd won anything. He looked like a man who'd finally stopped free-falling. And that's the first step. Not victory. Stability. Because most people lose these fights before they ever enter a courtroom. They lose in the weeks where their life looks messy, where their address changes, where they miss work, where they sleep in a car and then try to explain it. The system doesn't punish you for being innocent. It punishes you for being unstable. And unstable can be manufactured. That's what Claire understood. That's what Martin paid for. So I didn't chase them with anger. I built a floor under my son. Then, once the boys were asleep, I started the next part. The part Ethan couldn't do alone. I didn't search for a lawyer. I searched for a specific kind of lawyer. Someone who handles custody battles and understands money structures, trusts, holdings, asset shielding. The kind of legal machinery people hide behind when they want to look clean while doing dirty things. I made calls. I listened more than I spoke. Some attorneys sounded hungry, like they wanted a fight for the story. I didn't want that. Some sounded tired, like they'd already made up their mind about fathers who end up in vans. I didn't want that either. Then I found her. A woman with a calm voice and no interest in drama. She didn't tell me she could win. She told me what she needed. Timeline, she said, documents, every email, every filing, every financial statement, everything. That's when I knew she wasn't for sale. Because a lawyer who sells outcomes talks in promises. A lawyer who fights systems talks in paper. I met her in a small office that smelled like printer toner and coffee. I brought a folder. Then I brought another. Then a third. She didn't smile. She just opened the first tab and started reading. Every few minutes, she'd ask one question. Not, how does that make you feel? Not, are you okay? One clean question at a time. Who drafted this? When did this change? Where's the original? What happened after this date? And while she worked, I watched Ethan. He sat straighter than he had all week, not because he felt safe, because for the first time, the fight wasn't happening inside his head. It was happening on paper, where the truth can actually weigh something. When we left her office, the ocean wind hit us hard. Ethan pulled his jacket tighter. He didn't look at me. He just said, "So what now?" I looked back at the cabins and the school and the quiet little life we'd stitched together in 7 days. "Now," I said, "we stop trying to convince people with words. We give them facts, and we do it in the right room." He nodded once, slow, like a man finally stepping onto solid ground. And for the first time since I'd found him in that van, I didn't see shame in his face. I saw focus. 2 nights after we met with the attorney, I couldn't sleep. Not because I was worried about court. I've been worried before. This was different. This felt engineered. So I sat at the cabin's little kitchen table with a cheap lamp on, a legal pad, and Ethan's box of documents. The ocean wind kept tapping the window like it wanted in. Ethan was down the hall, sleeping in a chair with his phone in his hand, like a man afraid he'd miss something important. I didn't wake him. I just started reading. Slow. Page by page. Anything with letterhead went in one pile. Anything with a signature line went in another. And then I found a folder that looked too clean. Newer paper, heavier stock. 3 words on the front. Donovan Family Trust. That name showed up everywhere in the story, but it was always in the background, like a shadow you don't focus on until it moves. I opened it. The first page didn't look like a weapon. It looked like something you'd brag about at a family dinner. A trust fund. In Lucas and Noah's names. Not Ethan's, not Claire's. The boys'. For a second, even I felt relief. Because if there's money sitting there for your grandkids, you think, okay, at least someone's thinking about them. Then I kept reading, and that relief died quietly. There was a section labeled Trustee Powers. I'm not a lawyer, but I can read plain English. It said the trustee had discretion over distributions. It said the trustee could decide what was in the best interest of the beneficiaries. It said the trustee could approve or deny requests for housing, education, medical costs. And then I saw the name of the trustee. Martin Donovan. The grandfather. The same man funding the legal team trying to paint Ethan as a risk. I turned the page. There was more. A clause that looked harmless until you understand what it's doing. It said any funds used for the boys could not be released if the non-custodial parent was deemed financially unstable or unable to provide a safe environment. Those words weren't accidental. They were the exact words being used against Ethan in court filings. So here's the trap. If Ethan can't provide, the trustee can claim the children need help. If the children need help, the trustee can step in. And the moment the trustee steps in, he controls the lifeline. Housing assistance, school tuition, even medical bills. All of it. Not to help Ethan, to replace him. It was a trust fund with handcuffs. And legally, it was clean. It was wrapped in the language of protection, best interest, stability, safety, words nobody argues with. But in practice, it did one thing. It turned fatherhood into a permission slip. I set the papers down and just stared at the table. There are cons that steal your money, and there are cons that steal something worse. Your position in your own family. The next morning, I waited until the boys were gone to school. I made coffee. Ethan sat across from me, rubbing his eyes, trying to look awake. I slid the folder toward him. He didn't touch it at first. He just looked at the name on the front like it burned. "I didn't even know this existed," he said. "I know," I told him. "That's the point." He opened it anyway. I watched his face change while he read. Not anger first, not grief. Confusion. The kind that comes when your brain is trying to understand how something that looks generous can feel like a knife. "They made this for the boys," he said. "Yeah," I said. "They made it around the boys." He flipped the pages faster now. His finger landed on the trustee line. Martin. He swallowed. Then he hit the clause about financial instability and just froze. "So, if they convince the court I'm unstable," he said, voice flat, "then they control everything." "And if they control everything," I said, "they can claim you're unnecessary." He stared at the paperwork like it was speaking a language he didn't want to learn. "This is legal," he said. I nodded. "That's why it's dangerous." He leaned back hard, like the chair might give out. For a second, I thought he was going to break. But he didn't. He did what he'd been trained to do this whole time. He went quiet. Like silence could make it less real. And that's when I said it. Not loudly, not like a speech, like a decision. "They're not just fighting you in court," I said. "They're building a system where you lose even if you're right." Ethan's jaw clenched. "So what do we do?" he asked. I took the folder back and tapped the page with the trustee powers. "We do what they're doing," I said, "but we do it cleaner." He frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means we stop arguing about who's good and who's bad," I told him. "We talk in mechanisms." I pointed at the clause again. "They used paperwork to lock you out." I flipped to the next page. "They used definitions to call you unstable." I flipped again. "They used the word best interest to make themselves look like heroes." I looked up at him. "If they're using the system to lock your kids behind glass," I said, "then we're going to use the system to open that door." He exhaled, slow. "And how," he asked, "do you open a trust you don't control?" I didn't answer right away, because the answer wasn't a feeling. It was a plan. And plans need time. I stood up, walked to the counter, and grabbed the folder we'd been building since the day I found him in that van. Pay stubs, school enrollment confirmations, medical records, photos of the cabin, receipts, a timeline. I set it on the table next to the trust documents. "This," I said, tapping our folder, "is you being stable. And this," I said, tapping Martin's trust, "is them pretending you're not." Ethan looked back and forth, like he finally saw the real battlefield. Not a courtroom, not a family argument. A structure. A structure built to make you fail. I picked up my phone and opened a new note. I wrote one line at the top. Conflict of interest. Then another. Trustee discretion. Then another. Child protection provision. Ethan watched me write. His voice dropped. "So you think Martin made this to protect them? Or to control them?" I didn't hesitate. "Both," I said. "That's what smart people do when they want power. They don't choose between looking good and being in control. They do it at the same time." He sat there for a long moment. Then he nodded once, not like a man asking for mercy, like a man stepping back into his role. And I said the thing he needed to hear. Not comforting. Useful. "From here on out," I told him, "we don't win by being louder. We win by being correct. And if they used a mechanism to lock you out, I said, closing the trust folder, then we're going to find the mechanism that forces it open. The night before the hearing, the cabin felt smaller than it ever had, not because the walls moved, because the stakes did. Lucas and Noah were asleep in the room down the hall. Their backpacks were lined up by the door like they actually lived there. Ethan sat at the kitchen table with the same folder we'd been building for weeks. He wasn't reading it. He was just staring at it. Like if he looked long enough, it would tell him how tomorrow ended. I poured him a glass of water and set it down. He didn't touch it. His hands were flat on the table, fingers spread, like he needed to feel something solid. Outside, the wind kept rolling off the ocean and slapping the porch steps. Ethan finally said, "Dad, what if they're right?" He didn't say it like a question. He said it like a confession. I didn't answer right away. I watched him. His eyes weren't angry. They weren't even scared. They were tired. The kind of tired that comes when people have been telling you who you are for so long, you start checking your own reflection for proof. He swallowed and kept going. "I hear it in my head," he said, "all the time. Financially unstable, volatile, risk." He laughed once, but there was no humor in it. "It's like, even when I'm calm, I'm wondering if I'm calm enough. Even when I'm quiet, I'm wondering if quiet looks guilty. Even when I'm trying to do the right thing, I'm thinking maybe the right thing is me not being there." He stopped. His jaw tightened. And then he said the line that told me exactly how deep it had gone. "Sometimes I think Lucas and Noah would be safer without me." That's what gaslighting does. It doesn't punch you in the face. It puts a mirror in front of you and makes you question your own shape. It takes a decent man and convinces him that decency is danger. It doesn't happen in one big moment. It happens in 1,000 small ones. A raised eyebrow from a lawyer, a comment in a hallway, a report written in confident language, and then the worst part. People who barely know you start repeating it like it's fact, and you start repeating it too, in your head. I pulled out the chair across from him and sat down, not to lecture him, not to motivate him, just to be there. He looked up at me like he was waiting for me to argue. I didn't. I asked him one thing. "Ethan," I said, "when was the first time you thought you might be the problem?" He blinked, like he hadn't expected that. Then he looked down at the folder again. "It was months ago," he said. Claire had already moved out. Her dad was already involved. They kept saying I was reckless with money, that I was unstable. And I tried to defend myself at first. He rubbed his forehead with the heel of his hand. "I sent spreadsheets, I sent bank statements, I sent proof. But every time I answered one accusation, they came back with a new one. And then it wasn't just them. It was her attorney. It was a mediator. It was even people at my kids' school looking at me like I was a story." He paused. And after a while, I stopped fighting it. Because fighting it made me look angry. And anger was exactly what they wanted. He sat back. His voice got quieter. I started thinking, maybe I'm missing something. Maybe there's something wrong with me that I can't see. That was the moment. Not the van, not the trust fund, not the court order. That moment. When a man starts reviewing his own life like he's on trial. I leaned forward. "Listen to me," I said. "You being careful doesn't make you guilty. You being quiet doesn't make you dangerous. You holding yourself together doesn't mean you're lying." He looked at me, but I could tell it wasn't landing yet. Because when doubt gets planted, it grows roots. So I told him something I hadn't talked about in years. Not a big, dramatic story, Just a simple truth. When your mother died, I said, people expected you to fall apart. They expected me to fall apart. And I didn't. Not because I wasn't hurting. Because I had to keep the house running. Keep the lights on. Get you to school. And do you know what people said? He didn't answer. I said it anyway. They said I was cold. They said it like a diagnosis. Like grief has one approved shape, and if yours looks different, you must be broken. I nodded toward the folder in front of him. That's what they're doing to you. They're taking your restraint and turning it into suspicion. They're taking your effort and calling it instability. And if you let them, they'll keep tightening that definition until you don't fit inside your own life. Ethan's throat moved like he was holding something back. He whispered, "But what if I slip? What if I say the wrong thing tomorrow?" I didn't sugarcoat it. "Then we don't slip," I said. "We don't give them a story." He looked at me. I could see the shame trying to climb back into his face, the same way it had in that van. So I cut it off before it got there. "Ethan," I said, "you are not a risk to your children." I said it slow, not dramatic, certain. You're the person they reach for when they're scared. You're the one who remembers their allergies. You're the one who ties their shoes the same way every time because they like it that way. He stared at me, like he wanted to believe it, but he didn't trust belief anymore. So I gave him reality. I opened the folder and pulled out two things. A photo from the first week at the cabin. Cac asleep on Ethan's shoulder, mouth open, holding his dad's shirt like it was a handle. Noah on the floor, with toy cars lined up perfectly, like he finally felt safe enough to focus on something small. I put the photo in front of Ethan. Then I slid over the school attendance record. Perfect. No missed days. I slid over the pediatric visit summary. Up to date. I slid over the lease agreement for the cabin. Stable address. Then I pushed the folder back toward him. "This is who you are," I said. Not what they wrote, not what they whispered, not what they repeated until it sounded official. Ethan's eyes filled, but he didn't wipe them. He just sat there, breathing through it, like a man coming back into his body. After a long minute, he nodded once, small, but real. "I'm tired of asking to be seen," he said. I nodded. "Good," I said. "Tomorrow, you don't ask." He swallowed. "What do I do?" I stood up and closed the folder. "You walk in," I said, "and you let the paper speak. You answer what's asked. You stay calm. You don't defend your dignity with emotion. You defend it with consistency." I put my hand on his shoulder, firm, steady. "And when they try to turn your silence into guilt," I said, "you remember something." "What?" "That your kids don't need a perfect father," I said. "They need their father." Ethan took a breath that sounded like he'd been holding it for months. And for the first time since I found him in that van, his posture changed. Not loud, not dramatic, just straight. He looked at the folder again, but this time it wasn't a threat. It was a tool. He stood up. "Okay," he said. One word. No speech. Just commitment. And that's when I knew gaslighting had finally hit a wall. Not because we had better arguments, but because he stopped putting himself on trial. Tomorrow, he wasn't walking into that hearing as a man begging to be forgiven. He was walking in as a father, ready to be recognized. The next morning, we left before the sun fully came up. Ethan didn't talk much in the car. He just sat forward, hands on his knees, like he was holding his body in place. The courthouse was already busy when we got there. Metal detectors, plastic bins,
people whispering like the building itself could hear them. Claire was there with Martin. They didn't look nervous. They looked prepared. Martin wore that calm face rich men wear when they're used to rooms bending around them. Claire didn't look at Ethan, not once. Her attorney did. He gave Ethan a quick scan, like he was checking a file photo against the real thing. Then he smiled, like this was already over. We sat down. Our attorney opened a thin folder, not a dramatic stack, not a performance, just paper. That's what people don't understand about court. It's not a movie. The loudest person doesn't win. The person with the cleanest timeline does.
The hearing started with the usual language: supervised visitation, concerns regarding stability, financial risk. Words that sound official enough to make you doubt your own eyes. Ethan kept his mouth shut. He didn't flinch. He didn't defend himself with emotion. He just listened. And that's when Claire's attorney made his move. He called a witness. The same guy Ethan had told me about. The old partner. The one who used to eat at our table. The one who used to text Ethan jokes at midnight. He walked up like he belonged there, hand on the Bible, eyes on the judge. Then he said it. That Ethan was reckless. That Ethan couldn't be trusted with money. That Ethan had a pattern. He used the word unstable like he was reading it from a script. Ethan's jaw tightened, just for a second, and then he let it go, because he knew something the witness didn't. We weren't going to fight him with feelings. We were going to fight him with receipts. Our attorney stood up. Calm voice. One question. Mr. Keene, you're currently receiving compensation from a consulting arrangement, correct? The witness blinked. Yes, for advisory work. From which company? He named it. A small holding company most people had never heard of. Our attorney nodded like it was nothing. Then he held up an exhibit. Is this your signed consulting agreement? The witness leaned in. His face changed. It was his signature. The date was recent. The amount was printed in black. Not huge enough to look like a bribe, big enough to change a man's spine. Our attorney didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. He just asked the next question. And you were aware that this company is controlled by entities associated with Martin Donovan, correct? Martin shifted in his seat for the first time. Just a small movement, but it was the kind of movement that tells you the room is no longer yours. The witness tried to explain. It's just standard consulting. I didn't. Our attorney cut in, still polite. So your testimony today is being offered while you are actively being paid by a company tied to the opposing party. Silence. Not courtroom drama silence. Real silence. The judge looked down at the paper, then back up at the witness. And just like that, Ethan didn't look like a risk anymore. The risk was sitting on the witness stand. Claire's attorney tried to recover. He turned it back onto Ethan. He brought up the van, the fact Ethan had been living out of it. He tried to make it sound like proof of incompetence. Our attorney didn't argue. He didn't defend. He stood up again and said, Your Honor, we'd like to submit additional evidence. A dashcam clip, a voice memo, time-stamped, dated, clean. The dashcam showed what Ethan looked like on those mornings. Not raging, not drunk, not out of control. It showed him parked in a safe place. It showed him opening the sliding door carefully. It showed Lucas and Noah buckled in. It showed Ethan handing them breakfast bars. It showed him walking them into a public bathroom to wash their hands. Small things, but in family court, small things are the whole case. Then the voice memo played. Ethan's voice, calm, speaking into his phone. Pick up at 8:10. Kids are safe. I'm taking them to school. No threats, no ranting.
just consistency. The judge listened, and I watched something shift. Because for weeks, Claire's side had been selling a story, and now the court was hearing a different one. A man under pressure, still behaving like a father. Then our attorney went to the part they didn't expect. The trust. The thing Martin thought no one would look at closely. Our attorney held up a document and said, "Your Honor, there is also a financial structure impacting custody and access here." Claire's attorney frowned. Martin's face stayed calm, but his eyes hardened. Our attorney continued, "A trust fund established in the children's names." "That sounds like a benefit," the judge said. "It can be," our attorney replied. "But the issue is control." Then he laid it out. The trustee structure, the voting rights, the conflict of interest problem, the clause that quietly disqualified Ethan from having any say based on vague language that could be triggered by allegations alone. It was legal, on paper, but it created something ugly in real life. A financial lever that could influence custody without ever saying the word custody. Our attorney didn't call it evil. He didn't insult Martin. He just asked the question that matters in court. Is this structure in the best interest of the children? He then submitted the notice we had already filed, the one Martin didn't think we'd find. A formal request invoking the trust's child protection provisions. A mechanism built into the trust that required independent review if there was evidence of self-dealing or conflict. That was the real move. Not a confrontation, a trigger, a lever, a system inside the system. Martin finally leaned forward. He whispered something to Claire's attorney. Claire's attorney stood up fast. He objected. He tried to call it irrelevant. The judge didn't bite. Because now it wasn't just about Ethan's emotions, it was about structure. And structure is where power lives. The judge asked a few questions, direct, specific. Then he looked at Ethan, not with suspicion, with attention. He asked Ethan how long he'd been employed at his new job. Ethan answered, clear. He asked about the children's schooling. Ethan answered, clear. He asked about housing. We handed over the lease. Clear. No speeches, just facts. When the judge called a recess, Ethan didn't celebrate. He didn't shake his fists. He just let out a breath he'd been holding for months. We stood in the hallway. Claire walked past without looking at him. Martin walked past, eyes forward, but his jaw was tight now, because he knew what had happened. We didn't attack them. We didn't humiliate them. We simply put the truth in the one place it couldn't be rewritten. When the judge came back, his tone was different. He spoke like someone making a correction, not granting a favor. He expanded Ethan's parenting time. He reduced the supervised restrictions. He ordered an updated evaluation based on actual evidence, not assumptions. He also ordered independent oversight on the trust structure pending review. That last part didn't sound emotional, but it was the part that mattered, because it meant Martin couldn't use money as a backdoor anymore. Outside the courthouse, Ethan didn't look like a man who won. He looked like a man who could finally stand still. And I understood something I'd never put into words before. In the world we live in, real power doesn't scream. It files. It documents. It shows up with dates and signatures and proof. And when you activate the right mechanism, you don't need revenge. You just need the system to do what it was built to do. The consequences didn't come in the form of some big, satisfying revenge. They came the way consequences usually come when you stop playing defense. Quiet. Official. Slow. A formal notice to the trust administrators. A conflict review. A request for independent oversight. Then a letter from a compliance office. Then another one. Martin didn't get dragged in public. No headlines, no humiliation.
But the leverage he liked to hold in private started to disappear, piece by piece. Claire's attorney stopped speaking like the future was guaranteed. Her tone changed first. Shorter emails, more careful wording. More "we propose" and less "we demand." That's how you can tell a system is finally looking at someone. They get polite. Not because they grew a conscience, because the paper trail is watching. A week later, we drove back to the coast. Not to celebrate, to reset. Robert had found a small wooden cabin off-season. Nothing fancy. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen that smelled like old pine and dish soap. The kind of place you'd rent if you cared more about quiet than appearances. The boys started school again. New backpacks, new lunchboxes. The first morning, Lucas ran ahead like the world had never been heavy. Noah held Ethan's hand a little longer before letting go. Ethan didn't say much at drop-off. He just stood there until the bell rang. Then he turned around and exhaled like he'd been underwater. At night, the cabin went dark early. No city glow, no traffic. Just the ocean somewhere out there, and the creak of the porch when you stepped wrong. One evening, Robert came home with a box, a wooden bridge model, the kind with thin little planks and tiny screws. Lucas and Noah climbed onto the floor like it was Christmas. Ethan sat down with them, still wearing his work shirt. Robert took the instructions out of the box and smoothed them flat on the table. He didn't make a speech. He didn't talk about healing or new beginnings. He just pointed to the first step. "Start here," he said. The boys tried to rush it. They wanted the bridge to stand up right away. Ethan stopped them gently. "Slow," he said. "One piece at a time." So they did. They lined the parts up. They matched numbers. They tightened screws until they felt the wood catch. And when a piece didn't fit, Robert didn't force it. He set it aside and found the right one. That was the difference. That's what I learned watching my son in that cabin. A simple life isn't the same thing as a broken life. Sometimes it's the only way you can see what's real. Because when there's no money flashing around, no big house to hide behind, no image to protect, you find out who shows up. You find out who tells the truth, and you find out what actually holds a family together. It's not blind trust. Blind trust is what gets used against you. What holds is respect. Respect enough to make things clear. Respect enough to write it down. Respect enough to build a process that protects the kids, even when the adults get ugly. That night, the bridge finally stood up on its own. Lucas tapped it with one finger to test it. It didn't fall. Noah smiled like he'd done something important. Ethan didn't celebrate. He just looked at it for a long second. Then he put his hand on his son's shoulders and said, "Good job." And I thought about how fragile it all looked in the beginning. A few thin pieces of wood, tiny screws, a structure that shouldn't work if you rush it. But if you place each piece where it belongs, if you tighten what needs tightening, if you don't skip steps, it holds. That's how you rebuild a family. Not with promises, with proof. One plank at a time.